today we're going to talk about one of the two important theories of development that exists within our economic geography unit. It's called Wallerstein's world systems theory, oftentimes kind of known as the core periphery model. So I've mentioned these terms before in class: the core, the semi-periphery, the periphery, and now we're going to talk about what they mean and sort of how they tie in with economic geography as a whole. And so kind of to start with, and we will sort of revisit this map in a second. Here we have the world sort of broken up into the three categories that Wallerstein uses, which is core, semi-periphery, and periphery. And this is an older map, I think, from an older version of our textbook. But you can kind of notice the correlation that exists between, we would generally associate core countries with sort of more developed regions of the world. So you have kind of East Asia with Japan, Oceania, New Zealand, Australia, Western Europe, and then North America with the United States and Canada. So those would be the core regions. The semi-periphery, you see, are in yellow. So a lot of the kind of BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as well as kind of regions of South America and Eastern Europe and kind of Southwest Asia or the Middle East and South Asia. And then the periphery would be most of Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and parts of Central Asia and Central America as well. So this is an older version of this map, and I think has changed a little bit. You can find kind of newer versions of this map in your textbook, and they include some sort of updated categories. So one thing to talk about is the fact that Wallerstein's model is sort of fungible in that it changes. And here you can see kind of the list of countries by region. But the whole system is essentially talking about the economic relationships that exist between different parts of the world. So the core regions, the semi-periphery regions, and then the periphery. So essentially, the sort of summary of the model would be that, in general, raw materials and cheap labor, in terms of migration, often flow from the periphery to the semi-periphery and the core. And then you have sort of the goods produced within the core that flow to the semi-periphery and the periphery. And you have kind of in the middle of the semi-periphery that essentially looks at or sort of has kind of a place in the middle where they're oftentimes a producer of goods and from raw materials, but they're also in some ways still have economies that are based in sort of extraction of raw materials in some ways. So the whole theory essentially attempts to explain the dynamics between countries at different levels of development. And essentially the way to think of this country, or the way to think of this model, is through the lens of exploitation. And Wallerstein sort of sees the relationships between different countries at different levels of development as sort of fundamentally exploitative, where you have a lot of the resource extraction that happens in less developed countries and by sort of transnational corporations, as sees that sort of transaction as fundamentally exploitative. And essentially where you have sort of labor and migrant policies that encourage flows from the semi-periphery in the periphery to the core. So thinking about this kind of in the context of history, you can think about kind of the connections to imperialism and colonialism that sort of naturally exist within this, the idea of exploitation and resource extraction, and kind of applying it to a more contemporary world. We can also, you might sometimes hear the term neo-colonialism, which is essentially kind of large corporations performing a lot of the same types of things that governments did in the past in terms of extracting natural resources from less developed countries. So like I said before, the way to think of kind of the model is that every country in the world falls into kind of one of three categories, and the core tends to exploit the semi-periphery and the periphery for resources and labor, and the periphery tends to be exploited by both the semi-periphery and the core. And obviously, the semi-periphery does some exploiting and some is exploited in some ways. So kind of the way to conceptualize this to me is a country like Mexico as a semi-periphery country. It falls in the kind of the developing country category, where you have oftentimes obviously labor and resources flowing to the United States. It has a large oil industry. A lot of the things produced in Mexico end up in the United States. But Mexico, and also in some ways, is also a destination for migrants from less developed countries within Central America. and obviously, because of its political power, has kind of a large amount of influence within the region itself. So thinking about it from that way, you see sort of the dynamics in play a little bit. And here we see a map of that, where you have on the left-hand side, migration from Mexico to the United States and sort of the dynamics of that. And then on the right-hand side, you see a lot of the migrants that come through Mexico, and some even end up staying in Mexico. And in fact, kind of many have recently, because of some of the political policies passed kind of in the relations between the United States and Mexico, from other countries within Central America. So you have that kind of migration is sort of an interesting thing to think about in the context of core periphery. All right, so a closely tied concept to the core periphery model, or to Wallerstein's world systems theory, is called dependency theory. So this is, I think, in some ways kind of a predecessor to Wallerstein's system, and has a lot of the same ideas, or a lot of the same lens. So the dependency theory says that developing nations have failed to develop not because of internal barriers to development, as modernization theorists argue, but because the developed West has systematically underdeveloped them, keeping them in a state of dependency. So in the other video we watch, we will take a look at some of the dynamics that exist within Papua New Guinea, but the term resource curse is oftentimes used. And the resource curse is a really interesting way to look at development, and essentially what is the tie between whether not a country has lots and lots of natural resources and how developed they are. So, and it says, and you can see this with some interesting exceptions, but you oftentimes see a huge correlation with this. The idea that less developed countries that have lots of natural resources tend to actually lag behind other countries in terms of development. So this is for a lot of reasons, but essentially, you oftentimes have a lot of political instability, whether it be sort of resource conflicts and militias and different groups that pop up to sort of either prevent the exploitation of the resource or to get in on the action a little bit, and political corruption that obviously comes from having large amounts of money sort of pumped into the country, and maybe the political system isn't developed enough to sort of guard against that. And also because of kind of the idea of economic exploitation that might take place, where you have lots and lots of extraction of natural resources, but most of the money flows outside of the country. And why there might be some form of reinvestment in terms of jobs, and even reinvestment in general, most of the money might kind of ends up leaving the country in and of itself. So dependency theory is pretty well connected to Wallerstein's world systems theory. I think kind of has a lot of the same ideas. And I don't see a ton of difference between the two, other than the fact that they sort of developed at different times. But Wallerstein kind of relies pretty heavily on dependency theory. Okay, so to wrap up, kind of thinking about some other beliefs associated with this theory. Wallerstein sort of believed that the economic system should be viewed sort of as a whole functional unit, featuring a structured set of economic relations between the different parts of the world that relied on exploitation and essentially extraction of resources. And that economic activities related to the periphery were usually rooted in some form of resource extraction. So whether it be sort of mining of precious materials or oil, or even some form of like plantation style farming. Like we said, money flows to the core. The resources themselves are oftentimes used in products that are produced in the core, and you have sort of the periphery left behind in this sort of fundamentally exploitative relationship. And one other thing that's interesting to note, and I mentioned this before when we looked at the map, these categories actually change for individual countries. So you might think of a country like China, that if we were looking at the idea of exploitation in the 1950s or 1960s, might have been kind of firmly in the periphery, in that there was sort of a fundamentally exploitative relationship between Western countries and China. China has sort of, as they've developed, they have kind of started to gain relations with other countries that have a lot of the same characteristics that core countries have. So it sort of fits into this interesting like way in which circumstances can sort of change for an individual country. But it also believes that there's always going to be a core, a periphery, and a semi-periphery. There's always going to be this sort of fundamental relationship that is rooted in exploitation. So one thing to keep in mind is this is the theory, and this is one of two theories that we're going to talk about. So It's useful to think of this as a theory and sort of a lens to view the world, but not to sort of accept it full, without thinking about the downsides of it and thinking about the downsides of looking at the world this way. But keep this theory in mind as we're sort of talking in the future about the way that labor and sort of economic activities are divided up across the world, the role of transnational corporations and financial institutions, and the way that they might reinforce some of these concepts that Wallerstein talks about. Okay, thanks. Bye.